Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners! Over the course of 2024, 3 different Chinese-Uzbek teams of archaeologists have made some important discoveries. In June, an ancient settlement dating back to the 8th century BC was excavated near the Surkhandarya River. Then, in autumn, another team made a series of discoveries on the famous Mengchak-Tepe site in the Fergana Valley on the northern bank of the Sirdarya River. The team discovered 6 tombs, 2 building foundations and a number of artifacts, including silk fragments and pottery from ancient China's Han Dynasty. According to the team, the discoveries give us a glimpse into the culture, burial practices, beliefs and architecture in the Fergana Valley in the early medieval period. The site was arguably an important meeting point of Eastern and Western cultures and a hub on the Silk Road, a complex network of trade routes connecting China with the rest of the world between the 2nd century BC and mid-15th century CE. It facilitated the exchange of goods like silk, spices, metals, as well as ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. Importantly, the discoveries confirmed the Han dynasty's friendly relations with its neighbors in what is today Central Asia. Finally, in 2024, an Uzbek-Chinese archaeological team discovered the remains of 6 buildings and 25 ancient tombs dating back to the Kushan Empire in a site called Chinoterpa in the village of Chino along Uzbekistan's Surkhandarya River. The Kushan Empire was a powerful Central Asian entity that flourished from the 1st to the 3rd centuries CE and played a significant role in facilitating trade and cultural exchange between Central Asia, China, and India. The scientists claim that the discovery has helped to understand the nature of the empire. Previously, it was believed to have been established by the Yuezhi people, a nomad tribe that had migrated to the Oxus River around 2,000 years ago from the territory of China. The head of the archaeological team, Wang Jianxin, a 71-year-old archaeologist from the Northwest University in Xi'an, has long studied the question of what happened to the Yuezhi people after they left China. In 2013, he reached an agreement with the Institute of Archaeology and the Uzbek Academy of Sciences to study the issue. He believes that his discovery has proven that the Yuezhi tribe did not conquer the local people in an attempt to colonize them and impose their rule, but rather that they coexisted with the locals and helped them develop trade along the Silk Road. In one interview, he said that his team's discovery has challenged the Western centralized interpretations of ancient Silk Road culture and enhanced the world's understanding of China's contribution to ancient Silk Road civilization. Most of the Chinese archaeological undertakings in Uzbekistan have been conducted by the already mentioned Northwest University from Xi'an, which, by the way, was once the eastern departure point of the Silk Road. It established an archaeological partnership with Uzbekistan back in 2009, and as of 2024, more than 70 joint works have been carried out in Central Asian countries. In 2018, the university opened the Collaborative Research Centre for Archaeology of the Silk Road. And as of 2023, the center had launched joint programs with 17 universities in 8 countries, which include Kazakhstan and Tajikistan. So why does this all matter? And why would such ancient history matter for China's relations with Central Asia today? For years, Xi Jinping, who is China's president, has urged China's scholars and journalists to tell China's story in a way that reflects its significant past and present, and, more importantly, future. In 2013, China launched the Belt and Road Initiative, often referred to as the New Silk Road. a global infrastructure development strategy to enhance China's connectivity with the rest of the world, including Europe and Africa, through road, rail, energy, and maritime routes. Just like back in the day, Central Asia is again one of the crucial areas of China's New Silk Road. The Belt and Road Initiative is not only an economic project, but also geopolitical and geocultural, as it aims to project the reach of China's power and influence beyond its borders, including in Central Asia, which has long been viewed as Russia's sphere of influence, regardless of how bad that sounds. This process has accelerated following the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which left Central Asian countries wary of Russian influence in the region and open to cooperation with other players, China including. In Uzbekistan, which is the most populous and industrialist country in Central Asia, China took over Russia as the top trading partner in 2023. In one of the interviews, Wang, so the head of one of the archaeological teams working in Uzbekistan, said that while his research is academic, its results match up with the needs of China and Uzbekistan. He also said, quote unquote, "We are studying the past to understand and shape the present and future." Now, I would like to invite you to take a more in-depth look at China's interests and goals in Central Asia and listen to my interview with today's guest, Temur Umarov. Welcome to Tehran Talks. My guest today is Temur Umarov, who is a fellow at Carnegie Russia Eurasia Centre and who focuses on Central Asian countries' domestic and foreign policies, as well as China's relations with Russia and Central Asia. Hi, Temur.
Hi, Agnieszka.
So nice to hear you.
Very nice to hear you as well. Very excited to be on your brand new podcast.
Thank you. My listeners have just listened to a short introduction about China's archaeological work in Uzbekistan. So if you could start from the very beginning and explain what's the point of China's archaeological work in Uzbekistan and Central Asia?
So I would say that there is no actual kind of grand strategy of China in specifically archaeological work in Uzbekistan or in Central Asia. And this is the process that is happening on several levels. So we have the initiative from the grassroots level that is coming from the historical universities, institutions, and it's not in any way is a, initiative that is put down from the very top. But at the same time, it happens in the atmosphere where China on the top level in Beijing is focusing very much on reshaping its global reputation. And China has been doing this consistently from 2013, approximately starting with Xi Jinping's speech where he mentioned that it is important to tell China's story well. And the phrase is being understood not exactly as China now should be focusing on retelling its history across the world, but history is a part of this narrative. It's a big bubble of initiatives that are being supported by China across the world in the media sphere, in social media, through support of independent bloggers or through China's state-owned kind of propaganda machines. And the main goal of it is to tell all of those stories about China that are popular around the world, but from Beijing's perspective. And the archaeological work that you mentioned before falls into one of those categories, because from Beijing's perspective, history, including China's history, including China's historical presence across the globe, has been told by the West, and all of the archaeological work, all of the art and museum exhibitions, it all has been dominated by Western scholars, by Western institutions. And now, since China has much more economic power, it can reshape some of the perspectives that exist maybe in the mindset of the people who read historical books or go to museums, which, on a kind of grand scale of things, I wouldn't say that this is a total misconception and that China is completely, following some of the ideological goals here. I would agree partially that the current history books that most of the people are reading and that the kind of current perception of many things that happened to us historically, this is a product that has mostly been dominated by the Western scholars. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that everything that exists in history books is completely false and needs to be retold by the, I should say, very biased institutions that are supported by the Chinese government.
So what is the story that China wants to tell in Central Asia?
So the story that China wants to tell in Central Asia, it can be divided into several categories. The first category, of course, needs to portray the continuation of the Chinese civilization, so that the current political regime in China seems as the one that inherited everything from centuries ago, and that it's not a brand new power that just appeared on the map in 1949, but actually these are the same people, same civilization that has existed for centuries. And for that, China, of course, needs some of the different historical facts that it can use in its relationship with the Central Asian countries and, other partners that it has across the world. The second category is to portray that there has been connections between what is known today China and what is known today as Central Asia, that China didn't come to the region in the 1990s, but actually the connections between China and Central Asia exist throughout the centuries. And here we go into the third category. What China is really focused on is everything related to the Great Silk Road, because the current grand project that Xi Jinping supports, the Belt and Road Initiative, has also been supported through the narrative game and through using the facts to portray that it's not just the new project that China came up with 10 years ago, but actually this is the continuation of what China has been doing for ages, for centuries. And for that, it's very important for Beijing to invest into different, projects, including archaeological researches in the region that would play along with this narrative. So overall, what China wants to really show in the end of it all is that the history of relationship between China and Central Asia are going back in times, and there shouldn't be any surprises that these two entities in the current international relations are getting closer to each other.
So if we can go back in time, what kind of relations or what kind of connections China had with Central Asia? And I would like you to tell in the beginning about those pre-Soviet connections, but also how these relations were developing during the Soviet times.
So if we go back in time, we can really find a lot of examples of connections that existed between China and Central Asia, or at least as what we know as China and Central Asia in the modern phase. But historically, of course, the connections existed. and the current archaeological work that is being conducted in Uzbekistan, and the one that you talked about in the beginning of the podcast, it's just one example of that, of the Yuezhi nomadic tribes that originated from what is known today as China's Gansu province, but back in the 2nd century BC traveled across the region to the west and ended up in Sogdiana, Bactria. And this is being portrayed again as the connections and relations that early China had with Central Asian region. But apart from that, there are numerous cases of so many different aspects of this relationship in economic, in trade, regards in religion. The Kushan Empire has also been known as the one that kind of connected China and the West in Central Asia. So there are many interesting cases throughout the history that needs to be researched, and in a way, putting aside all of the political aspects of the current historical cooperation between Central Asia and China, it's actually a very great moment when researchers are digging into the layers of history and opening up something brand new that wasn't discovered before. But what China doesn't really want to be researched, in my opinion, is those facts of the history that go against the current political agenda in Beijing. And this is something that is, again, a disadvantage of the current cooperation between Beijing and Central Asian states in the history domain, because when you have some of the independent researchers from Western institutions coming to Central Asia and discovering something about China's presence there, you can criticize them, you can go into debates, and the research that is being conducted there can be, openly discussed on different platforms. But when it comes to the same research that is being conducted by Chinese archaeologists, they are limited in the narratives that they're sharing, because those narratives should be published in Chinese academia. And Chinese academia is not known for its freedom, right? So because of that, some of the aspects of the history, for example, the pre-Soviet times where Russia had pretty influential standing in the current territory of Xinjiang Autonomous Region, and, overall, actually, the potential of Russian Empire in the Xinjiang region is not being pretty much discussed. And this is kind of a side of it that disturbs some of the people who follow what is happening in the research between China and Central Asia.
So why China doesn't want this part of history to be researched?
Because, it goes against the political agenda. It goes against the interests of the Communist Party of China. And it's not a big surprise that CCP is an organization that is well present in all of the spheres of life inside the PRC, and academia is not an exception. And, history is seen by most of the political regimes across the world as a very influential tool to control the narrative. So, in a way, even knowing the history of CCP and knowing the history of how the current political regime in China has been established in 1949, it's pretty much visible that Beijing doesn't want to accept the role that the Soviet Union has played in its establishment. So if you will take a look, for example, at the speech of Xi Jinping or any other official during anniversaries of Chinese Communist Party, you will see that Soviet Union isn't mentioned at all. However, historians know for sure that the role of Communist International Comintern, the international organization run by the Communist Party of the USSR, has played a pretty significant role in the establishment of the PRC. And this is made with the main goal to portray the current political regime in China as the one that is a continuation of the centuries of other Chinese rulers, Chinese empires, and to accept the fact that the political regime that exists today is something that has been, in a way, brought to China from the outside is something completely unacceptable. And from that point of view, of course, when the historians go to Central Asia, they are not so much interested in the research that can be sensitive. So everything that is related to the Soviet times or pre-Soviet times is not the point of their research. Their point of research is something that goes back in time and that cannot be really sensitive and can be freely interpreted because of the lack of other research that has been conducted in the field.
So, if I understand it correctly, acknowledging the role of the Soviet Union in somehow shaping also China would diminish the Chinese historical significance. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it will diminish China's own agency. It will diminish, the fact that what is being seen as the main source of legitimacy of current political structure in China is actually something that didn't naturally evolved inside China, but also was supported from the outside. And it also shows, of course, that, it kind of points out to the limits of the current leadership of China, because it gives some of the credit to the Soviet Union, and it's not something that people in Beijing would like to be associated with.
We'll come back to Russia, but if you can tell us what exactly is China's policy in Central Asia? What are its main goals in the region? We can start maybe with the Belt and Road Initiative, which you have mentioned already. But so what is the main reason why China is investing in its relations with Central Asia?
So Belt and Road Initiative is a good example of how China's influence in the world can be seen as something very significant, but at the end of the day would be very, very vague. So if we take a look at the BRI, everybody knows about it. Everybody heard the BRI. Everybody knows that it's somehow related to the Silk Road. Everybody knows that there are a lot of money in the BRI. But when you try to dig a little deeper and try to find out what the BRI really is, here you stumble upon a problem, because no one actually knows what the BRI really is. Even the people who have created the BRI, people sitting inside Chinese Politburo or in Chinese MFA, they themselves don't know what exactly the BRI is. And there is no actual document that will tell you in details what are the projects that can be seen as a part of BRI and what cannot be seen as a part of BRI. And it's a very vague umbrella initiative that China promotes for more than 10 years already. And the main goal of it is that it's very vague. And China can actually name every single project that it somehow has relation to a part of BRI, and vice versa. If China doesn't like any project across the world that is associated with China, it's not the part of the BRI. But the second is much more difficult to do than the first one. So what I mean by that, before 2013, China has already had pretty significant infrastructure projects in Central Asia. I would name two of them. The one is the natural gas pipeline from Turkmenistan to China through the territory of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. The second project is the oil pipeline from the Kazakhstan territory to China. Those two projects have been built and have been operating before 2013. But the moment Xi Jinping announced the BRI, which happened in Astana, where you are right now, as I know, Agnieszka, this two big infrastructure projects automatically became the part of BRI. And now everything in the world that is somehow related to China can actually become a part of BRI. So you have infrastructure projects, you have logistical projects, you have telecommunications company opening up courses that are branded as a part of being, somehow related to the BRI. You even have contests of electricianers who are also doing something as a part of BRI. You have hotels, you have language courses. So it has become a brand, but not necessarily a huge amount of projects. But this is not the main goal of China in Central Asia. Many people tend to think that the main incentive of China to be present in Central Asia is to exchange resources of Central Asian countries on mutual trade or investment or something like that. However, the main goals of Beijing in Central Asia always been concentrated on the security domain. For China, the appearance of independent Central Asian countries in the early 90s was a moment of shock. They were not anticipating the collapse of the Soviet Union. They were not ready for it. And they were not, on the top of it, ready to have three independent Central Asian countries on the border with Xinjiang, that from Beijing's perspective is considered to be a very sensitive region that can be source of security problems for Beijing. And because of that, from the very 90s, China was very much focused on making sure that the political regimes that will now be established in Central Asian states will be cooperating with Beijing and will not be sympathetic towards anything that is happening in Xinjiang on the grassroots level.
Can we maybe remind our listeners what exactly is the Xinjiang region and why China would be afraid of a growing connections between Central Asian countries and the region?
Sure. Xinjiang is the western region of the People's Republics of China. It is a vast, autonomous by the constitution region. However, there is very little autonomy that Xinjiang has. The autonomous status was granted to Xinjiang for the reason that the society that lives there is very different from the majority of China. It's the majority of the population in Xinjiang are ethnically Uyghurs. They are the part of this Turkic family of ethnosis, and they speak different language, which is much closer to Uzbek than to Mandarin Chinese. They are Muslim by religion. And historically, religiously, traditionally, they're much closer to Central Asia than to China. In the last 4 or 5 decades, China has been trying to keep Xinjiang under its total control because throughout those years, there has been numerous cases of different activists and organizations fighting for more autonomy and sometimes even for independency of Xinjiang. And those people were not only using legitimate instruments to be independent, but also because of the mounting control from Beijing, were radicalizing sometimes and even conducted terrorist attacks in Xinjiang and also in the capital of China, in Beijing. And because of that, from Beijing's perspective, it was very important to keep the region under control and keep the relationship with the newly independent Central Asian states in a way that they will not be sympathetic towards those people who want to see Xinjiang as an independent entity. And if you will take a look at China's actions in the 90s, with regards to Central Asia, you will see that this was number one question that China pointed out to their new partners in the region. They were establishing relations between the security agencies. They were encouraging Central Asian states to let them know if any activities with regards to, activism in Xinjiang will be seen in Central Asia. It's actually a well-known fact that the first president of Uzbekistan, Islam Karimov, has personally handed out some of the documents about Uyghur activists who were based in Uzbekistan to the chairman of China back then, Li Pen. So China was very much interested in that, and China continues to be focused on security cooperation with Central Asian states, and everything else that we are discussing, everything that is related to the Belt and Road, to economic presence, to investment. This is the second layer of interest that has been built already on the foundation of consensus on security matters.
This is really interesting because if we think about China's military cooperation with Central Asia, we mostly think about Tajikistan, right? But we don't really, it doesn't come immediately to mind that China might have military cooperation or might have this kind of goals in the region when it comes to, Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan. So maybe we can now look at the different countries in the region and how China is developing its relations with these particular countries when it comes to, seen from the perspective of its goals in the region. So let's maybe start with Tajikistan, where we know that China already has a military base. Like, how is this relationship developing?
Yeah, this is actually a very important point, that although Central Asia is seen as this one united region, it's actually very different. And it's also very different when we look at Central Asia from other countries' perspectives. So when we speak about China and Tajikistan, Tajikistan is seen by Beijing as a unique partner in security cooperation. For China, Tajikistan is a unique country in Central Asia for several objective reasons. First of all, because of the geography. Tajikistan is the only country in Central Asia that borders both Afghanistan and China itself. And Tajikistan, at the same time, has a very difficult to secure border with Afghanistan. And because of that, for the last several years since the Taliban took over the political regime in Afghanistan, there have been a lot of questions about whether or not Tajikistan, in case of emergency, in case something happens on the border, will be able to secure itself, and what will happen if Tajikistan fails to do so, and then some of the elements of terrorist organizations, not necessarily the Taliban itself, but other countries or other terrorist organizations that use the territory of Afghanistan to, as a basis while there is a chaos in the power, that they can use Tajikistan as the gateway to China. So because of that, Tajikistan has been number one security partner of Beijing, and we can see how it works on the ground. On the ground, China has two bases on the border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan. Those bases are being built and controlled by the People's Armed Police of China. This is not a part of China's army. This is a paramilitary law enforcement agencies that are responsible for border security and fight against terrorism, both inside China and outside. And those bases are unique. China doesn't have any other similar bases anywhere in the world. So Tajikistan is a pretty important partner from this perspective. And apart from that, there is also regular military drills that China conducts with Tajikistan on the bilateral level, in addition to the aid that Tajikistan's army is getting from Beijing, with also the military trade that also takes place between Tajikistan and the PRC. And from that point of view, Tajikistan is not only unique inside Central Asia, but worldwide. In addition to that, there is a pretty significant presence of China in Tajikistan in other spheres. Economically, China is number one trade partner for Dushanbe, and at the same time, China is one of the most important sources of aid. And if you will be walking in central Dushanbe and you will see a brand new building of parliament of Tajikistan, you will notice that underneath this building there is a small monument with Chinese characters. And Chinese characters are there not because Tajikistan wants to promote Tajik level on the parliamentary level, but because the parliament itself was built by China, and China didn't take a penny from Tajikistan for it. And this is the way China is present in Tajikistan, not only in the military sector, but also in other parts of life.
Okay, and how about Kazakhstan, which obviously is a completely different country from Tajikistan, but also has very close relations with China?
Kazakhstan is a different story. Kazakhstan is not seen as a weak partner from security perspective. Kazakhstan's army is much stronger objectively from Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan's territory doesn't have a lot of breaches of security. From that point of view, Kazakhstan is more self-sufficient and doesn't need a lot of presence of China in security. And actually, Kazakhstan itself wouldn't allow to see some of the examples that exist in Tajikistan. In Kazakhstan, China mostly focuses on economy. Kazakhstan is an important source of natural resources for China. And in addition to that, Kazakhstan is the hub that China uses for its relationship with other Central Asian countries, and also with Europe and, broadly saying Eurasia. So from that point of view, Kazakhstan is, as a big economic power in Central Asia, is much more interesting for China from pragmatic financial perspective and rather not so much interesting from the security perspective. Also considering that Kazakhstan is the country that is sandwiched between Russia and China, growing security presence in Kazakhstan would be something that Russia might read as interrogation into its own interests, into its own sphere of influence in a way that Russia perceives it. So because of that, we don't necessarily see any huge presence of China in Kazakhstan's security domain.
And when it comes to Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, this presence is also mostly economic?
Kyrgyzstan is also an interesting example because Kyrgyzstan doesn't really have much natural resources that can be interesting for China. However, there are several projects that China also, has in Kyrgyzstan, also in the sphere of mining. However, because Kyrgyzstan is, compared to other Central Asian countries, Kyrgyzstan is politically not stable and very difficult to predict the political stability of the country. China there is much more proactive in security domain as compared to Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. So Kyrgyzstan, one of the unique features of Kyrgyzstan in relations with China is that in security relationship, there are private security companies being present in the country. Most of them are being hired by Chinese state-owned companies or independent companies that have their projects in Kyrgyzstan. And in the last decades, there have been several cases of Chinese investors facing aggression from the local communities in Kyrgyzstan. And after those cases, China has really focused on making sure that it doesn't rely on security agencies and security services provided by Kyrgyzstan itself, but rather brings its own private companies to do the job. But other than that, Kyrgyzstan also plays a role of a country that is, in a way, gateway of China to the region. But unlike Kazakhstan, we're not talking about big scale of logistic opportunities that Kyrgyzstan can provide, but rather small scale trade that is mostly going to the Central Asian domestic market, which is not pretty huge for now. And with Kazakhstan, the scale is much bigger.
And how about Uzbekistan? I mean, what we've got left is Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan.
I will start with Turkmenistan because Turkmenistan, broadly speaking, represents only one big fact of interest for the PRC, and it's natural gas. Turkmenistan is the biggest provider of natural gas, not only in Central Asia, but worldwide. And for the last decade, Turkmenistan has been exporting around 90% of its natural gas to China. So it's fair to say that China is a monopolistic importer of Turkmen natural gas. And because of the fact that Turkmenistan is a very closed country, we don't really know what are the details of the agreement that exists between Turkmenistan and China. We don't really know what are the potential prices that China acquires natural gas upon. We don't know whether or not the investment into exploring some of the natural gas reservoirs inside Turkmenistan have been provided by China and under what circumstances. So there are many unknowns, but the fact is there. Turkmenistan survives thanks to the export of its gas to China. And Uzbekistan is a different story. Uzbekistan also is exporting some part of its natural gas to China. This is one of the part of the cooperation between Tashkent and Beijing. But other than that, there are many things that Uzbekistan can put on the table in its partnership with China. From the infrastructural and logistic point of view, Uzbekistan doesn't really have a direct access to China because of its geography, but in the last year, there has been made some progress in this regard with the agreement that Tashkent, Bishkek, and Beijing have came to finally build the railway from China to Uzbekistan through Kyrgyzstan. This railway has been discussed and planned for more than I'm alive, but only last year, these three countries have agreed to finally start working on realization of this project. And with this railway, Uzbekistan will finally have direct access to Chinese market and will be connected to the Chinese territory, which opens up a lot of opportunities for Uzbek producers and also opens up opportunities for Chinese businesses. And because in the last years, there has been growing connections between economic entities of Uzbekistan and China. China's producers are increasing their presence in Uzbekistan, and the amount of companies that operate in Uzbekistan with Chinese capital accounts for already thousands of them. China is the biggest trade partner of Uzbekistan. China is the biggest provider of investment into Uzbek economy, and the amount of loans that Uzbekistan is taking from China also is on the rise. So in the future, I'm not going to be surprised to see that Chinese economic presence in Uzbekistan will be compared to the one that we got used to see with Kazakhstan, for example.
Well, there is this one elephant in the room that is, of course, Russia. And China in Central Asia very often steps into this domain that has always been traditionally dominated by Russia. So can we say that China is trying to replace Russia in the region? And how is Russia seeing, or how is Russia responding to this potential threat to its interests?
Yeah, I mean, when we look at Central Asia being sandwiched between Russia and China, the logical thought that will come to our mind will tell us that there are those two countries that are interested in their presence. They have interests that overlap in the region, and it potentially can lead to conflict between those two countries. But what I encourage always when I get these types of questions, I encourage always to look at the nature of relationship from different perspective, from the perspective of Central Asian countries themselves. And if we do that, we will understand that Central Asia doesn't really need one country to replace another. What they need is to have actually a combination of both Russia and China. And in ideal situation, it will be combination of Russia, China, and someone else like Turkey, like the countries of European Union, the countries of Southeast Asia, the Arab countries of the Gulf, and, countries from other parts of the world. Because the nature of politics or geopolitics in which Central Asia finds itself is very tough to leave to leave where Central Asia lives without direct access to the ocean, without so much freedom in their neighboring alliances with Russia, China, Iran, Afghanistan on the border. So it's not a very welcoming, I should say, neighborhood. And because of that, what Central Asia wants, does, and will continue to do, in my opinion, is to design a platform where all of different countries that have some interest in being present in the region will have this opportunity to be there. But the main condition for them to be present in Central Asia is to coexist with other countries. So, for example, right now, the European Union and Russia are not in a very good relationship with each other. However, we see that in early April, European Union conducts its first summit with Central Asian countries in Samarkand. And at the same time, we see that in May, Central Asian leaders will go to Moscow as they were doing every year. So it tells us that even though China's presence will be growing in Central Asia, it doesn't necessarily mean that Russia's influence in Central Asia will automatically diminish. Russia's presence in the region is, I should say, a unique presence. No other country around the world has the amount of potential that Russia has. I'm not saying that Russia is using this potential as it could have been using, but what Moscow has inherited from the Soviet Union is something that no other country has. And most importantly, Russia has two things. First of all, it's Russia's soft power, although Moscow has a long history of using this soft power to threaten its Central Asian partners. But in theory, Russia could have used that soft power to grow its influence in the region and to make Central Asian societies much more friendly towards Moscow. But it's a different story why Moscow is having a foreign policy that is aggressive rather than trying to attract countries through its soft power. And the second tool that Russia has in handy when it comes to its presence in Central Asia is informal ties between the political elites. Those people who are ruling Central Asian states and those people who are ruling Russia from the Kremlin, they have known each other for ages. They have grown up in the same country, which is the Soviet Union, and they speak the same language, which is Russian. And they've known each other for years, and they have very good relationship. And in addition to that, they have mutual interests that sometimes go against the national interests of each of the Central Asian countries, but they sometimes tend to put their own interest or corporate interests above the national interest. So as long as Russia has those instruments, and as long as we have those political regimes in Central Asia and in Russia that we have today, we will continue be living in a world where Russia's influence in Central Asia will not be diminishing.
So coming back to China, we know that not everyone in the Central Asian region is happy with the growing influence of China. And these are, for example, religious Muslims, as we've already mentioned, who support the struggle for independence or who support the struggle against oppression of Xinjiang Muslims. How does China deal with this issue in its relations with Central Asian governments?
So China wants to ignore this part of the relationship whatsoever, but this is impossible. And in this question, there is a strategy that China uses with Central Asian countries, which is broadly known as a principle of non-interference into domestic issues. So what China is broadly saying is that we are doing what we want inside of our legitimate territory. And at the same time, you can do whatever you want inside your territory with your citizens, and we're not going to be paying any attention to that. So this approach is actually working, and it's something that is attractive for the political leaderships of Central Asian countries. And this is the main reason why they have been supporting some of the Chinese statements in the UN with regards to Xinjiang. And from Central Asia's point of view, some of the countries in Central Asia also have, in a way, their own Xinjiang situations. Like Tajikistan has Pamir, Uzbekistan has Karakalpakstan, and they also don't want other countries to interfere into some of the policies that are discriminative in their own countries, because if they will be criticizing China for what it's doing in Xinjiang, it will automatically mean that they indirectly supporting any criticism of domestic politics overall. So from that point of view, China is using that principle in its relationship with the leadership, but with the society, it tries to work through other instruments. It's trying to promote its soft power tools in the region by supporting some of the mutual films that are being screened, by supporting some of the schools, different universities, by encouraging Central Asian students to go to China and get education for free, and by promoting its Confucius Institutes and Luban workshops across Central Asia. So by doing all of those different initiatives, China wants to change the perspective about it, and China wants to tell Chinese story well. China wants to take the lead in the narrative building about its own country. And from that point of view, the question of what is happening in Xinjiang is a complete taboo, or it's totally told from a perspective that actually Xinjiang is a very rapidly developing part of China, that people in Xinjiang are happy and they don't want to be autonomous. Kind of they identify themselves as citizens of China, and everything is going in the right direction. And all of the accusations of everything else is a tactics of the West to discredit China in the eyes of global community, something like that.
We're coming towards the end, so I've got one last question that I would like to ask you. In Central Asia, especially in Kazakhstan, what I can see is a growing number of Chinese cars in the streets, and the difference, if you compare it to a couple of years back, is huge. So we can see that this, at least the economic influence of China in the region, is growing. With this, probably also its soft power, at least in some sections of society. So, how do you think the Chinese influence in Central Asia will be developing? What way it will be going, and whether there are any threats connected with this growing influence for Central Asian countries, for their sovereignty, and for their future in general?
It's a great question. Honestly speaking, I should say that there are limits of my understanding of the future, because no one knows what's going to happen. But there are certainly several trends that we see in China's presence in Central Asia that are going to be dictating the future of this relationship going further. So first of all, the growing amount of Chinese cars is a good example of how China's presence in the region will be transforming. If we actually go back not so long ago, go back a decade ago, we wouldn't see any Chinese brands on the streets of Central Asian cities. And this happened not because of China didn't have that many brands. Actually, all of the cars that China is now producing were already existed. All of those brands like BYD have already been there. But in the recent years, the Chinese car industry has actually revolutionized the global market. And currently, Chinese brands are the leaders in the e-cars industry, even doing better than Tesla. And the fact is very much visible in Central Asia. So in the future, there might also be some of the sectors of economy where Chinese producers, Chinese brands will be more successful than their Western competitors, where their Western competitors, like in the automobile industry, will be too conservative to dare to try something new, to implement some of the new technologies into already existing products, and because of that will not be able to compete with China. And also considering that China has huge industrial capacity and can rapidly create something new and immediately put it on the market, it gives China the upper hand in the technological domain. So in the future, I would say that we will see a bigger presence of China in technologies, not only in Central Asia, but especially in Central Asia, because of the proximity and because of already existing ties between the region and China. Other than that, I would not be also surprised to see more ideological influence of China being visible in Central Asia. As I've already said, China is already building parliaments for some Central Asian countries. And in the future, there might be other examples like that. The amount of students, the amount of young people who are traveling to China is growing. And those exactly students who get their first education in China can in the future be used by Beijing as the representatives or this, ambassadors of China's education system in their hometowns and play a crucial role of life, marketing tools that China will be using to promote its successful educational system. And especially when you compare Chinese system to the Central Asian ones, like, for example, if you compare it to the one that exists in Turkmenistan or in Tajikistan, it's not a secret that Chinese universities are much better and prepare much better specialists in their field. So considering that other directions for migration from Central Asia are going down because of the instability of Russia's migration policy at the moment, it will also not be a big surprise for me to see more and more people going to China and exploring China by themselves and being enrolled in Chinese educational system and then promoting Chinese way of learning and way of living and the way of Chinese kind of life ideology back in their hometowns. And in addition to that, I want to say that although previously I said that Russia, China, and other countries will be coexisting in Central Asia because this is what Central Asia in the end of the day wants and needs, but there is something that China can bring to the table that others cannot, and this is the image of future. In the last decade, there has been a lot of talks and discussions and research about what the future global order will look like and what the state of international relations is going to be and who is going to be who in those future days. And what everybody in the field of international relation agrees upon, even if they are not supportive of the fact that China is going to be more influential, they all agree that the place of China in this global order, which will be much bigger than it is today, and certainly than it was previously. So from that point of view, China is seen by Central Asian both leadership and broad society as a country that is gonna rule the world in the future, and they don't want to have bad relationship with the country that is gonna dictate our future.
Thank you so much, Temur. That was really interesting. And I hope that's not our last conversation.
I also hope so. And very, again, excited about the brand new media focusing on Central Asia. This is something that we very, very much need right now in the times where so many voices about Central Asia are being shut down. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.